Last year, it was the UCI Super Worlds between the Tour de France and the Vuelta España. This year, we've had the Olympics. So for a second year in a row, it feels like the final men's Grand Tour of the season has rolled around quicker than ever. It starts this coming Saturday, and unlike the Giro and Tour before it, there's no clear favourite. Coming up, I'll be going through the 21 stages in detail, plus the favourites to take the crown this year. First up, my favourite, the stats. So this year's Vuelta is not for the sprinters. The 21 stages are categorised as follows: 2 individual time trials, 5 hilly stages, 5 medium mountain stages, 8 high mountain stages, and one flat stage. They up to a total of 3,301 kilometres, which is around 150k more than last year's edition. It's still the shortest Grand Tour of the year by distance, but there is by far the most amount of climbing. So the Giro d'Italia had 47,000 metres of elevation gain, there was 54,000 at the Tour, and there's going to be 62,000 at this year's Vuelta. Absolutely brutal. There hasn't been another Grand Tour this century with more climbing than this year's Vuelta. Sepp Kuss was the overall winner last year, where Jumbo-Visma, as they were called back then, had a clean sweep of the podium places with Roglic and Vingegaard on the other steps of the podium. It also completed a clean sweep of all 3 Grand Tours for the Dutch squad last year, making them the first team in history to accomplish that feat. Safe to say, things haven't been going quite so well for them this year, and while Sepp Kuss is back to defend his title, it's not a squad that's going into the race as the clear favourites, which was the case this time last year. Before I get on to the favourites though, I'll look at the route. So last year we started with that team time trial in Barcelona, partly in the dark. This year it's an individual time trial of 12 kilometres. Takes place in Lisbon in Portugal. So the Vuelta has only had 4 foreign starts before this year, and the first of those was also in Lisbon back in 1997. The route for that time trial is entirely flat as it tracks the coast to its finish in Oras, so this is not a TT that's going to result in big time gaps. Nonetheless, we will see some early differences amongst the GC contenders, and of course the quickest rider over those 12 kilometres will don the first red leader's jersey. And that person is very likely to be Josh Tarling of Ineos Grenadiers. Stage 2 of the race is the second of 3 on Portuguese soil, and at 194 kilometres, it's actually the second longest of this year's race. It's also the first of the mid-mountain stages, but I do think there's a chance here of a bunt sprint. The problem is that there are very few sprinters at the race, understandably, and therefore very few teams looking to control it. The final climb is a 4th cat and peaks with just under 20k's remaining. It's about 3k's long, 6% gradient, so hard enough to do some damage. That said, it probably won't hurt Wout van Aert. We'll be looking at about half the stages at this year's race and seeing a chance for him to win. On to stage 3 then, which heads across to Castello Branco. It's another fairly long one at 191 kilometres, and there's a similar amount of elevation gain as stage 2 at around 2,800 metres. On this one though, the last categorised climb comes a little earlier, with 43k's to go, whilst the finish is steadily uphill for the final 3 kilometres. Again, has Wout's name all over it, if Visma are prepared to put the energy in to control it. As on stage 4, they head into Spain for the first time, and this one is classed as high mountains. There are 3,600 metres of climbing over 170 kilometres, and it's the first summit finish of this year's race. And this is no ordinary summit finish. This thing is brutal. It's the Pico Viejas. So it's a climb that has been used before in 2021 when it was won by Romain Bardet. But that year they tackled this side of the climb around halfway through the stage before then circling back around and doing it from the easier eastern side. This year though, it's the summit finish. So after some manageable gradients for the first 2/3 of this climb, they arrive onto a 3k sector that averages 13.6%. It's so extreme and so narrow, Google hasn't even sent one of their cars up to give us a street view. And it took Bardet almost a quarter of an hour to do that 3k section in 2021. Without doubt, it's going to be the first big GC shake-up of this year's race, and you definitely one that you want to tune in for. They'll probably be pleased to get a little bit of respite one day later on what is a much flatter stage into Seville. In fact, this is the solitary flat stage of the race, and it truly is flat, fewer than 600 metres of climbing over 184 k's. If there's any day that is likely to finish in a bunch sprint, it's that one. It's back into the mountains on day 6 though, and a 185k jaunt from Jerez de la Frontera to Junquera. At 3,900 metres of elevation gain, there are actually only 3 stages that have more climbing this year. There's only one first cat climb though, which comes fairly early in the stage, and the rest of them are third category. That includes the one to the finish, which is 8.9 k's long, 3.9% gradient. I'd expect this one to be contested by a breakaway full of climbers who've already lost some time, and it might even be a stage where the red jersey changes hands. Stage 7 is classed as medium mountain, and the main difficulty is a second cat climb with 25 k's to go. It's called the Alto del 14%. So it's 7.4 k's long with an average gradient of 5.6%, but I presume there is a pitch at 14% in there somewhere. Again, probably one for the breakaway, as it's too far out and not hard enough for a GC battle. The next summit finish comes a day later on stage 8 into Cazorla. It's only 5 k's long and third category, but it's one of those typically irregular Spanish climbs. There's a 20% section at the very start of the climb, and the last 800 metres is also in double digits. Most of this climb was used in 2015 on a stage won by Esteban Chavez, but this year it carries on past the finish from that day. As you'd expect, it's a very narrow road. Then to wrap up the first 9 days of racing, there's another high mountain stage, predominantly in the Sierra Nevada region. This is the second hardest stage of the entire race, with 4,500 metres of climbing over just short of 180 k's. There are only 3 categorised climbs en route, but they're all first cat, and they all average close to 10% gradient. However, it's not a summit finish that day. From the final mountain, which they'll tackle twice, there's a long 23k descent down to the finish in Granada. And I'd imagine a fair few of the riders will know the roads quite well, since a lot of teams do altitude camps in that area. They'll have their much needed rest day after that, but they're straight back into the high mountains for stage 10. So there's a 15k climb very near the start of that stage, which will make it easier for the climbers out of GC to get up the road in the breakaway. Then they've got a trio of climbs in the last third of the stage that culminate in the first category Alto de Mugas. That's 10 k's at 6%, with the steepest gradients at the start. From the top, it's 20 k's down to the finish, so this feels like yet another stage suited to a breakaway win. And it's a similar story for most of the second week of the race. Every stage has around 3,000 metres of climbing. Stage 11 starts and finishes in Padron, taking a couple of hilly laps along the way. The last of those ramps is the steepest, that's the Puerto Cruceras, 3 kilometres at 9% average gradient, and from the top it's a rapid descent down to the finish. Now when I was looking at stage 12, Google had auto-translated the web page and the description of that stage, which was wavy type with a high end. Basically, hilly with a mountaintop finish. The stage is only 137 kilometres, but with 3,500 metres of climbing, it's a really intense day. Strangely, there's only one categorised climb, and that comes at the finish, but the roads ahead of it are constantly undulating. It's the ski station of Manzanada that hosts the finish that day, a long climb at 22 kilometres, but the gradients aren't too severe. This climb has been used once before at the race in 2011 when David Moncoutier took the win. I'm actually really looking forward to that stage though. It's so short, I think it'll be explosive right from the start and hopefully unrelenting to the finish. Stage 13 is the 4th in a row in the Galicia region, a little longer at 178 kilometres and with the same 3,500 metres of climbing. Again, hilly, but not mountainous for the most part, but with a mountaintop finish. The Puerta de Anzales is 7.5 kilometres at 9.3%, but that includes an opening couple of Ks that average 3%. Once this thing ramps up, it barely goes below double digits. The hardest part comes right before the line, with almost a kilometre at 14%. The race has been to that climb before, but not from this side, so this will be another first for the race and all the riders taking part. This is another big GC day, I'd say. there are highly likely to be some big gaps on that final climb. Stage 14 is a more steady affair with 3,000 metres of climbing over 200 k's. The stage finishes in Viablino, which they'll initially pass through fairly early on in the stage, and after that they tackle a large loop that includes the first category Puerto de Lleitarigos, which is probably the steadiest climb I've ever seen in my life. It's 24 k's long and barely deviates away from its 4.5% average gradient. I'll probably take a break here actually to apologise for my Spanish pronunciations. I speak a little bit of French, a very little bit of Italian, but no Spanish at all. Anyway, from there, it's about 15 k's to the end of what is the longest stage of this year's race at 200 kilometres. No rest for the wicked though, as stage 15 is one of the hardest of the race. Another short one at 143 kilometres, but with over 3,700 metres of climbing, it's very, very intense. There are 30 k's of rolling roads before the first big test of the day, the first category Alto de la Colladilla, 6.4 k's at 8.2%. It's this climb that they'll loop back on midway through the stage to tackle a second time before making their way towards a beast of a summit finish. The Cutu Negru is a climb that was tarmacked specifically for the Vuelta to pass in 2012 on a stage won by Dario Cataldo. It's 19 kilometres long with an average gradient of 7.4%. But look at those final 3 k's, 13% average with a max of 24%. At the finish, they'll be at the highest point of this year's Vuelta, 1,847 metres above sea level. Now this might not be the Queen stage of the race, but it's certainly amongst the most important for the general classification. Rest day number 2 follows, after which it's time for the final week, which starts with, you've guessed it, a mountaintop finish. It's one that will be familiar to a lot of you. Stage 16 finishes atop Lagos de Covadonga, which is being used for the 5th time in the last decade. The last time it featured in this race was in 2021, and that was when Roglic and Bernal went on the attack on the penultimate climb of the day, with Roglic going clear of the Colombian on the steepest part of the Covadonga. The run in this year is exactly the same, so hopefully we'll get more of the same fireworks. There will be a slightly more relaxed day for GC riders on stage 17. Apart from a couple of second category climbs midway through the 141k stage, it's a fairly simple run into Santander. Again, if there were a load of sprinters at the race, I'd expect this to be a bunch sprint, but there aren't, so it'll probably be another breakaway day. Believe it or not, it's actually been 21 years since the Vuelta had a stage finish in Santander, despite it being one of the most visited cities in the race's history. Stage 18 is another hilly day, albeit with only 2 categorised climbs, the second of which is the Puerto Herrera, which is a first category, and another short, steep climb. There's a fair way from there to the finish in the Izqui National Park though, all on rolling roads. That stage is in the Basque Country, with its notoriously tough terrain, so it's going to be another hard day in the saddle. There's yet another summit finish on stage 19, this time on the Alto de Moncalvillo, which was used for a stage in 2020, won by Primož Roglic. Another steep one with an average gradient of 9% over its 8.6 kilometres. The rest of that 173k stage isn't too taxing though, so this one should be all about that final climb. The same can't be said for stage 20, the hardest of the race if you go purely by elevation gain. So this 172 kilometre stage is littered with climbs. 7 of them are categorised for a total of 4,700 metres of elevation gain. The last of those is the Picon Blanco, where an old military base is located. That's 8 k's at 9% average gradient and last used at the Vuelta in 2021. It came quite early in that edition and stage won by Ryan Tarame, who also went into the leader's jersey. I almost feel sorry for the riders having to tackle that stage after everything that's come before it. They're going to be on their knees by the time they cross the finish line for stage 20. And it's not done yet because the race finishes with the second of the 2 individual time trials. Last year's circuit race in Madrid was a cracker. You'll remember the likes of Ganna, Evenepoel and eventual stage winner Groves attacking off the front. But if there's anything still to play for in this time trial, it will be a great watch. But the likelihood is there's going to be huge time gaps amongst the favourites by then. The time trial itself is just under 25 k's in length and fairly flat and not particularly technical as they make their way into the centre of Madrid. So, That's the route. Brutal, as I said at the very start. We just have to hope it's not so brutal that riders are afraid to attack it. Sometimes we see races or stages that are so hard on paper, it scares the riders into being more conservative. Time will tell, I guess. I'm exhausted though, just thinking about it and reading it out loud. So as a bit of respite before I get onto the favourites and a couple of the sprinters taking part, I'll give a nod to our shop. So we've got a whole range of t-shirts dedicated to this final big race in Spain, all of which you can find over at shop.globalcyclingnetwork.com, including the one that I'm wearing for this video today. We've also added to our French collection too, so there are a huge number of options to choose from if you would like to make a purchase. And any purchase you do make is massively appreciated and helps us to create all the free-to-view content like you're watching today. Right, favourites. And I'd best start with last year's winner, Sepp Kuss. Back then, it was his third Grand Tour of the year, but this year it's going to be his first. Illness at the Criterium du Dauphiné forced him out of the Tour de France, but he returned to competition in the best way possible. So he won the Queen Stage and the GC at the recent Vuelta a Burgos, one of the key warm-up races for the Vuelta. So he's clearly on decent form, but his team looks very different to 12 months ago. No Vingegaard, who's currently racing in Poland, and no Roglic, at least not on his own team. Visma Lease a Bike haven't confirmed their roster as I record this, but it looks like he'll be supported by Jan Uijtdebroeks, himself top 10 last year, as well as veterans Steven Kruijswijk and Robert Geesink. Dylan van Baarle will also be riding his first Grand Tour of the year. He's another rider who's been stricken by crashes and illness this season, as well as Ben Tulit. Wout van Aert, though, is the biggest name on their roster. He's making his debut at this race, and I expect that's with half an eye on preparation for a hilly World Championships in Zurich at the end of September. So, a solid squad. Can they win? I think Kuss has got a decent chance. There are 2 individual time trials, but with the sheer amount of climbing in this race, he should be in his element. He'll be fresh as well, won't he, which counts for a lot at this time of year. The big favourite for the race, though, is a man who's won it 3 times already. Primož Roglic, now riding for Red Bull Bora Hansgrohe. So his participation was confirmed at the start of this week by the team. After a bit of time off the bike following his abandon from the Tour de France, he did a 2.5-week altitude camp in preparation for La Vuelta, which I guess must have gone quite well. Now, in some ways, he's an unknown, but in others, he's not. Very rare that Primož Roglic turns up to a race without the form to win it. And he's got a really strong team to support him as well. Vlasov is here after his own struggles at the Tour de France, as is Giro runner-up Dani Martinez. Florian Lipovic, who impressed in the climbs in the early season, will add yet more firepower in the high mountains, whilst Adria, Aliotti, Dent and Gamper round out that squad. The other team with huge strength in depth is UAE Team Emirates, despite having left Juan Ayuso at home. So it seems like there's an undercurrent of discontent between Ayuso and his team, and there's speculation he's looking to try and find a way out. Anyway, the team they have brought is still super strong. The leaders are likely to be Adam Yates and Joao Almeida, but they've also got Isaac Del Toro, who's capable of anything, as far as I'm concerned, even though this will be his first Grand Tour. Brandon McNulty does his first Grand Tour for the year here as well, whilst they've also got Soler and Sivakov from the Tour de France, and Jay Vine, who's made an astonishing recovery from his Tour of the Basque Country crash in April. Filippo Baroncini, junior world champion in 2021, rounds out that squad, and is also making his Grand Tour debut. Now, none of the riders in that UAE squad have ever won a Grand Tour, but you wouldn't be surprised if that changed in a month's time. Our next favourite with the bookmakers is the Spaniard Enric Mas. Now, if you look at his form so far this year, that might come as a surprise, but this is a man who's always at his best for La Vuelta. Again, it's a solid squad at Movistar. Nairo Quintana will be hoping for a better form than he had at the Giro, although he did crash recently at Burgos. Pelayo Sanchez, you'll remember, won the gravel stage at the Giro and should have some stage hunting freedom here as well. Oyo Lazcano, he's gone up a level on the climbs this year, hasn't he? Whilst Aina Rubio will also offer decent support in the high mountains. Canal, Arcas and the ever-dependent Nelson Oliveira make up the rest of that squad. I think for them, a podium would be a fantastic result, along with a stage win on the way. Mikel Landa is another rider to watch. I think we were all pleasantly surprised by how well he performed at the Tour de France. Soudal's lineup isn't confirmed for the Vuelta yet, not even Landa himself actually, but I thought that James Knox will be there, possibly Matteo Catania as well. I'll move on to Ineos Grenadiers now, who have confirmed their squad. As I mentioned earlier, Josh Tarling will be the big favourite for the first time trial, and for the last one as well, if he makes it that far. He's making his Grand Tour debut at the age of 21. Now, of course, we all know that time trialling is what he does best at, but he really impressed a lot of people with his climbing at the Dauphiné in June as well. Their GC leader, though, will be Carlos Rodriguez. He was slightly disappointed in his result at the Tour de France, where he was 7th, but this is a new opportunity. Normally, he likes lots of climbing back-to-back, and there's certainly no shortage of that at this year's race. He made his debut at the race 2 years ago, and he was 6th overall, and I think he'll be looking to podium this time around, if only for his own progression. Laurens de Plus and Taman Arensman might get to go for their own GC ambitions as well, depending on how things go. Jonathan Narvaez is also in the Ineos lineup, but he'll be moving to UAE next year, whilst Hajduk and Rivera round out their squad. I think a podium and a couple of stage wins would be a success for that team. Next up, EF Education Easy Post, who will be led by Richard Carapaz. Whether that's with GC or just stage wins ambitions, I don't really know, but I hope it's the former. He was great at the Tour, wasn't he, taking that stage win, but he does seem to excel at La Vuelta. The race will mark the final Grand Tour in the long and successful career of Rigoberto Urán, so hopefully he'll go out with a bang, whilst Rui Costa will be looking forward to starting on home roads. Beyond that, their team is yet to be finalised again as I record this, but the team that is Bahrain victorious. Antonio Tiberi, Damiano Caruso and Jack Hay could all be up there on GC, whilst Torsten Trine would be a decent bet for a stage win. Matthias Skjelmoser and Giulio Ciccone will lead Lidl Trek's GC ambitions. Skjelmoser has never shone on the GC of a Grand Tour, but then he's only done 2 in his career so far. I reckon he should be up there, as he's another rider who should be relatively fresh. Keep your eye on Matthias Vacek in the sprint as well. He's not a pure sprinter, but I think with the relative lack of depth in sprinters, he'll give them a nudge. Groupama FDJ bring David Gaudu, who'll be looking to save his season in some respects. He's no stranger to stage wins at this race, which is why I expect him to focus on here, while Stefan Kung will be one of the only riders who can come close to Tarling in the ITTs. Astana have Fortunato and Tejada for the mountains, but overall, it's a young and quite inexperienced team, so a stage win would be unexpected, but maybe Harold Martin Lopez can surprise. He's been really solid this season. One man I should have mentioned quite some time ago probably is Ben O'Connor, riding his final Grand Tour for Decathlon AG2R. He had quite a long break after his successful Giro d'Italia, but 11th at the recent San Sebastian shows he's prepared well. With Valentin Paré-Pant, Felix Gall, Bruno Armorai, Victor Lafay and Geoffrey Bouchard also in their lineup, they've got a really solid team. Watch out for DSM's Max Poole as well. He finished a close second to Kuss in Burgos, and DSM also have one of the very few sprinters at the race in Pavel Bittner. He won 2 stages at that same race. Overall, quite a young squad, and quite a few riders actually over 70 kilos, so they'll be really hoping to make their mark on the few flatter stages. Jayco Alula have Dunbar, Zana and Harper for the high mountains, plus Schmidt and Demarchi for stage hunting. And I'm also expecting Bahey, the Ethiopian, to get in a couple of decent breaks in the hilly stages. Right then, Israel Premier Tech. They have got a really well-rounded team. The experience of Bennett and Woods, the climbing talent of Riccitello, Frigo and Turns, and the sprinting talents of Corbin Strong and Riley Sheehan. They should have something to fight for on almost every single stage of the race, and I'd expect them to come away with at least 1 stage win. And that is exactly what Thomas de Gent will be looking for on what will be his final Grand Tour for Lotto Destiny. Wouldn't that be fantastic to see? He's 37 now and therefore a little bit past his peak, but he's still strong as an ox. Lennart van Eetvelt will lead that team with Andreas Kron, stage winner last year, whilst Victor Campenaerts would obviously be another hugely popular stage winner. Guillaume Martin and Jesus Herrada lead Cofidis, but right now I've got no idea who's on the lineup for Arkea or Alpecin, although it looks like Luca Vergalito, the Zwift Academy winner, will make his Grand Tour debut for the latter, which would be fantastic to see. Intermarché haven't released their roster yet either, which leaves us with the two invited teams, Equipo Kern Pharma and Euskaltel Euskadi. They'll want to obviously be in every breakaway possible. And it'll be the final Grand Tour, actually, for Luis Angel Marte, who's the oldest rider in the race at 40 and 2 years older than De Marchi, who's the second oldest in the race. For Kern Pharma, Castrillo has had a decent year, including 7th overall at the recent Vuelta a Burgos, so watch out for him. Although his teammate Barada did even better there, finishing 4th overall. Well, that was a bit of an anomaly in his results so far this season. And that, I think, covers off most of the main players. Not a surprise to see the world's top sprinters sit this one out, but that does open the door to some new names to come to the fore in any stage that does finish in a sprint. It's certainly an interesting route, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Have the organisers made it too hard? Will it create negative racing? Or could we be set for the best Grand Tour of the year? Let me know in the comments section below. Since I'm on my Losum for this preview, I'll give you my prediction now. Isaac Del Toro for the overall win. I genuinely think that guy's capable of anything based on what I've seen this year and last, although I might be a bit early in predicting a Grand Tour win. Tarling for stage 1 and the first leaders jersey, Roglic for the points jersey because there are so many hilly and mountainous stages, and Team UAE for best squad. Let's see how I get on. Let me know your predictions in the comments as well. I will look forward to reading them. Right, thanks for watching everyone and enjoy the race. See you soon.